everybody, and welcome to the Ill-Fated Wives of Henry VIII podcast, brought to you by the founder and editor-in-chief, Emma Holbrook. Today, I am absolutely honoured to welcome our guest, critically acclaimed author and Tudor historian, Elizabeth Norton. And for those of you who don't know Elizabeth, which is a crime, by the way, she has written many books on Tudor women, including The Six Wives of Henry VIII and The Hidden Lives of Tudor Women. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's a real pleasure.
Oh, it's our pleasure as well. So today we're going to be talking about a very important part of Tudor history, which is the execution of Anne Boleyn, which happens on the 19th of May. And it's quite an exciting part of history, although it wasn't really exciting for Anne Boleyn, was it?
No, I mean, it was a bit of a nightmare, really, completely unprecedented, which is one of the reasons why it's so interesting in that, you don't behead queens, you don't arrest queens. Very few sort of historical precedents, if you like, for even the arrest of a queen.
And she actually made history for being the first executed queen, didn't she?
She did, yeah. Sorry, it's not history you'd want to make, really.
And Henry VIII kind of made himself famous as well through that. Well, not just through the divorce of Catherine of Aragon and making Anne his queen, but no one really expected it. As much as people hated Anne Boleyn, they didn't really expect it, did they, for it to happen?
Absolutely not. I mean, completely unprecedented. And I mean, it made Henry notorious, undoubtedly, whatever people thought about Anne Boleyn. And she was certainly not everybody's cup of tea. Actually, to go so far as beheading your own wife, it was shocking behavior. And it resonated. I mean, there are accounts from the continent, for example, I mean, it was said of Christina of Denmark when Henry was trying to marry her after Jane Seymour's death, that she said if she had two heads, one would be at His Majesty's disposal. So everybody knows what he has done to Anne Boleyn, and it is absolutely the thing that makes Henry notorious. We talk about the six wives, but if he had had just six wives and had been unfortunate and, they sort of died one after the other, or there'd been some annulments, he would be less notorious. It's the fact that he beheads Anne and also Catherine Howard.
And I think that that's something that not a lot of people realise is, even though Anne was hated as much as she was, even across in other countries, no one really expected it. Like, they expected him to divorce her as he did his first wife. And that kind of brings me into our first question of, why did he choose to execute Anne Boleyn instead of, divorcing her like Catherine of Aragon? And that also brings us into another part of, why didn't he send her to a nunnery where she might have, been able to live still, but without having any real part in his life?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. Henry absolutely didn't have to behead Anne Boleyn to be rid of her. He could have sent her to a nunnery. That would immediately bring the marriage to an end. That was what he'd been hoping to do with Catherine of Aragon initially. There was quite a lot of pressure put on her to retire to a nunnery because that brings a marriage to an end. He totally could have done it with Anne Boleyn. He could also quite easily annul the marriage. In fact, he does annul the marriage before he beheads her. And if he annuls the marriage, then she's not his wife. A lot of people Europe-wide didn't think his marriage to Anne Boleyn was valid in any event, so it would be quite easy to annul it. He's only got a daughter, so it's not as though there's a male heir who would be jeopardized by that. It would be a really, really easy thing to do, to get rid of Anne Boleyn and to be able to then have a relatively legitimate, in most people's eyes, third marriage. I think there are a couple of possible reasons. I mean, I think partly he doesn't want another ex-wife. He's had 3 years post-annulment with Catherine of Aragon, or nearly 3 years. She was a very difficult ex-wife. And I mean, this is no judgment on Catherine. I think she's incredibly brave, but certainly Henry found her very frustrating. There was always the threat of war hanging over with Catherine of Aragon because, of course, she's the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor, although Anne Boleyn doesn't come with quite as much baggage, if you like, in that regard. So I think he doesn't want an ex-wife. I think there's also an element of vindictiveness and also being quite neat and tidy. Henry is a very interesting character, and he can turn off the love, if you like, in a second. We've seen it with Thomas More, his old tutor, his old friend, sort of a mentor figure, has him executed. He'll do it with Thomas Cromwell. Cardinal Wolsey would have been executed almost certainly if he'd made it to London after his arrest. Henry is very good at sort of just emotionally saying, that's it, you're gone. And I think it's neater to behead Anne Boleyn. As awful as that sounds, she's
Mm.
gone then, doesn't have to worry about her.
Yeah, and you mentioned about the vindictiveness. Could it have been perhaps that he wanted to shame her in the way that he allegedly says that she shamed him? I mean, she's been accused of not only witchcraft and incest, but conspiring against the king by, allegedly trying to have a child with another man and pass it off as his. Could he perhaps have done the execution to shame her name as much as she shamed his?
Yeah, I mean, the charges against Anne Boleyn are deliberately awful and completely blacken her name. She is convicted of incest and adultery. So there's 5 men, one of whom is her own brother. Mark Smeaton's also very low born, and in such a class conscious society, that really counts. It's like, ooh, he's basically a peasant, Anne. I mean, it reverberates for decades. Elizabeth is to some extent tarred by the charges against Anne Boleyn. They are they're there in the background. It's the reason she can't really bring Anne Boleyn out into the open once she becomes queen, because Anne Boleyn is a convicted adulteress and she's convicted of incest, which is about as bad as you can go. I mean, absolutely, Henry's already blackened her name. Executing her is further blackening, if you like. I mean, there's always a debate over whether Henry thought she was guilty or not. I tend to fall on I think it's, he doesn't think she's guilty. And certainly Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, calls him the most cheerful cuckold. I'm paraphrasing, but the most cheerful cuckold anyone's ever seen. He becomes engaged to Jane Seymour the day after Anne's execution. He doesn't seem like a man devastated by news of his wife's infidelity. But I think, yeah, absolutely, he's angered by her. She hasn't given him a son. She hasn't been the wife she promised to be. She hasn't really been the queen he's expecting. And so he's just all out to destroy her, really.
And I think that's something a lot of people don't realize about Anne is that she is a strong character in her own way. I mean, she wasn't like a princess in comparison to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, but she had her own strengths. She made a lot of changes in England, and for Henry to just get rid of her, she must have had some fans in England, and perhaps that's why he had to be so brutal. He couldn't leave any room for her to be able to in a sense, get away with the crimes that he's accused her of. Of course, we don't know if she actually did it, and it's highly unlikely that she did. But it must have been such a shock to everyone to have Henry just say, "Oh, I'm going to put her on trial for incest," especially considering that even though her brother and her were close, not even her own uncle, who was one of the people who convicted her, was shocked and dismayed by the whole events.
Yeah, I mean, they're shocking charges. I mean, there's no getting away from it. It's, to charge someone with incest is about as bad. I mean, it really is about as bad a crime as you can do. And there are implications that she's plotting the king's death in her conversations with Henry Norris, saying, you look to fill dead man's shoes. She's saying, the argument is that she's planning to marry Henry Norris if the king dies. But yeah, I mean, it's such a shocking thing to do. It's absolutely brutal. But I do think the fundamental thing is, in Henry's eyes, Anne has been an abject failure as queen. She hasn't delivered what she promised. And he feels totally justified in just getting rid of her and moving on, because he is very good at compartmentalizing. He does move on with terrifying ease. We talk about the 6 wives of Henry VIII, but if he'd lived another decade, there would have been more wives. Catherine Parr was already on very shaky ground by the time Henry died. There'd definitely be at least 7, and frankly, probably more.
I mean, didn't he try to marry his best friend Charles Brandon's wife, Catherine Willoughby, wasn't it? Didn't he try to marry her at one point if he was going to get rid of Catherine Parr? It just shows you how Henry didn't care, essentially, really.
Yeah, so she's a contender for the 7th wife. I mean, by the time of his death, he's quite estranged from Catherine Parr. He won't allow her to his deathbed. In fact, she makes an attempt to get to Westminster where he's dying, and actually is turned back. He removes her from being regent for Edward. Actually, there was a plot against her life the previous summer. She was definitely unlikely to be the survivor. She's quite lucky, I think, that Henry died when he did.
I mean, I think that's why people have a lot of I think, a lot of respect for Anne. I mean, she went through a lot, and in a sense, she suffered quite a lot more than perhaps his other wives did, because not only was she the first of his wives to go through all this, but she had it quite brutal. She had this completely just blown up in her face. She didn't had no idea, did she? She was completely blindsided.
Yeah, and Anne was completely blindsided. She can never have suspected that Henry would have her arrested and executed. I mean, it must have been an absolute shock. And you know, I mean, there's only really one modern historian that argues at all that Anne was guilty, and even that's quite an academic exercise. In general, no modern historians think that Anne was guilty of any of the charges. They don't make sense, and the dates and the places are never quite right in the charges. So, you know, and this is completely, it will say something like, you know, on the 31st of December, Richmond Palace, you did allure your brother with your tongue in his mouth, or something like that. And actually George wasn't there, and they weren't at Richmond, you know, so they're completely fabricated. The key point with Anne is that there isn't a woman arrested with her, because queens are never alone. You know, they always have a female chaperone with them. This is why with Catherine Howard, Lady Rochford is also executed, because Lady Rochford has effectively been the chaperone between Catherine Howard and Thomas Culpeper. She sits with her back to them and sometimes falls asleep, but she's there. Anne doesn't have this female accomplice, which again is... they didn't happen, and the world knows it, really. I mean, there are even Eustace Chapuis, again, who hated Anne, says, you know, she didn't do it. She didn't do it.
And as even as you've just mentioned Lady Rochford, who was actually a part of Anne Boleyn's trial and execution. She was used for evidence of speech marks, as you might say, saying that she was the one that got Henry to convict Anne was sleeping with George. And I think there's a lot to debate with that, because there's the controversy that Jane hated Anne and that she wanted to get rid of her and she didn't like her. But then there's also the question of, what did Jane have to gain from losing her husband? I mean, yes, it would bring Anne down, but at the end of the day, it will bring Jane down also, wouldn't it? And the rest of the family, even Anne's family was barred from going to the execution. She was shamed by having Henry's illegitimate son there. She had her uncle there, but she didn't have her sister or her parents there. Of course, her brother was executed, and that's just a great shame.
The extent of Jane's involvement, I think, is probably a bit overstated. There's nothing that's sort of really contemporary that says, you know, she's giving this evidence against George. And actually, she sends George a message in the Tower, and he seems to take it quite well. It's difficult with Jane and George's relationship. I mean, obviously, they don't have any children, which may suggest that it's not a happy marriage. But equally, you know, some people just don't have children for whatever reason. She seems to have worn black for the remainder of her life, which does suggest, and she certainly doesn't remarry, which does suggest some level of affection. So it's difficult with Jane. I mean, I tend to think she's been somewhat smeared. She may be the source of some of the sort of intimate details of conversations between George and Anne. And George is accused of laughing at the king's poetry and saying he's badly dressed, for example. There's also the claim that George and Anne speak about the king being impotent. And these may have come from Jane, but it's less clear, you know, how freely this information was given, if it was given by her at all, and whether it was done with in a vindictive way, or whether actually she's also quite scared, you know. So I think the jury's out on Jane. Certainly she's involved in Catherine Howard's fall to a very, very great extent. But I think with Anne Boleyn, it's less clear what her involvement is.
And that's a noticeable pattern in the women associated with Anne Boleyn, is that they all have some negativity associated with them. If we look at her sister, referred to by sleeping with two kings, and then you have, you know, Jane Boleyn, almost every woman associated with her has a bad mark to their name, and perhaps that's something that Henry instigated. Perhaps he wanted there to be no positivity related to her family, and that's just a great shame, isn't it, that there's nothing, no positivity in regards to this family. When they're spoken about, it's always the negativity.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're seen as social climbers, which is, I mean, it obviously is genuine. Anne Boleyn wasn't born to be queen by any stretch of the imagination. So she is a social climber. But they're not they're not the upstarts that perhaps they've often been portrayed at. You know, her grandfather is a duke, her great grandfather is an earl. You know, on the maternal line, they're right up there. But the Boleyns are a little bit nouveau riche. But it's been a few generations. But yeah, I mean, Mary Boleyn is definitely Henry VIII's mistress before his relationship with Anne. She probably replaces Bessie Blount, the mother of his illegitimate son. She may or may not have slept with Francis of France. He calls her a very great whore and infamous above others. So, you know, again, the jury's out on that. But certainly, definitely Henry VIII's mistress. And that is how she's remembered.
And especially with Bessie Blount, there's a lot of argument that it's because of Bessie that Anne was able to become queen, essentially, and that's a big question. Was Anne compared to Bessie in comparison to Bessie wasn't even a queen, and she managed to give Henry the son he was looking for? Was perhaps Anne compared to Bessie in by Henry? Was he saying, you need to do what my other mistress did, or you're out, basically?
Yeah, I mean, Bessie Blount is the mother of Henry Fitzroy. Henry's only acknowledged illegitimate child. There are question marks over Mary Boleyn's children, and a lot of people very confidently assert, you know, they're descended from Henry VIII through the Carey children, and they may be. But Mary Boleyn, the crucial difference is Mary Boleyn is married when she gives birth to these children. So, I mean, it may be that there were question marks over their paternity and nobody was quite sure. With Bessie, she's an unmarried teenage member of Henry's court. They know who the father is. Henry acknowledges Henry Fitzroy immediately. Cardinal Wolsey is his godfather, and he's raised effectively as a prince. There are comparisons between Bessie and Anne. In fact, when Henry started to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, we know that takes 7 years. Actually, there was some confusion over who this Anne Boleyn was. Certainly on the continent, it was assumed that he was doing it to marry Bessie because, you know, if he marries Bessie, he gets a ready-made Prince of Wales. She's a widow by this stage. She was initially married off by Henry, but she's a widow. She's born other children, crucially other sons. So she's clearly pretty fertile. We don't know when Bessie was born. It dates to between about 1498 and 1500-ish. So she's around Anne Boleyn's age. She's a few years older, but not a lot older. She certainly would be a sensible candidate for Henry to marry because he can legitimize Henry Fitzroy and then have future sons with Bessie. So it does cause some surprise that Henry isn't planning to marry her, and instead he's fallen in love with this other English woman. But I think the key thing is Bessie has proved to Henry that he can father a healthy son, and for that reason, he doesn't need to marry Bessie because he just needs to be married to someone who isn't Catherine of Aragon, who clearly is at fault in the son department as far as Henry is concerned. So he can marry anyone who's not Catherine of Aragon because then he'll just father more sons. So I think Bessie actually does Anne a favour to some extent. I think Henry Fitzroy is a dark shadow hanging over Anne's queenship to some extent, because again, he is the proof that it's not Henry's fault that they don't have a son. Although, of course, he also dies in 1536, not long after Anne.
And there was some talk about legitimizing him at one point, and perhaps even, I think there's a source that says somewhere that Henry at one point was even considering betrothing him to Elizabeth. Of course, this is just rumours at this point because we don't really know what Henry was planning, and he did have questions over her parentage. But the fact that Bessie and Henry Fitzroy are present at Anne's execution, could that have had some impact? Did they have perhaps a connection, or do you think it was just they were there to witness it? It was a grand event. It was execution of a queen.
So Bessie's not present, just Henry Fitzroy, and he's sent as one of the observers. It's a closed doors execution. It takes place in the Tower. The Tower doors are locked, so people can't get in to watch. But that said, there's a lot of people there, official witnesses, and Henry Fitzroy is one of them. I mean, certainly there's an odd event that takes place not long after Anne's death, where when Henry Fitzroy goes to say goodnight to Henry, Henry basically just hugs him and weeps and says, "She was trying to kill you and your sister Mary." It's an odd one. I mean, there's certainly no evidence Anne was trying to poison Henry Fitzroy. She will have been wary of him. I mean, she does seem to have tried to befriend him. She sends him presents. She sends him a cap, for example, which he seems to have quite liked. He wore. So she does seem to attempt to befriend him, but he's certainly quite dangerous to Elizabeth, because he's the king's son. And actually not long after Anne's fall, in a council meeting, I think it's the Earl of Sussex says, if all the king's children are illegitimate now, can we not just have the boy? And the second act of succession is clearly geared towards potentially giving the throne to Henry Fitzroy. It basically says all the king's children are now illegitimate, and if he doesn't have legitimate offspring by a subsequent wife, then he can name his own successor. And almost certainly that's aimed at Henry Fitzroy.
And I think with Anne's execution, in terms of Henry Fitzroy, and you've mentioned Mary, it acted as almost a safeguarding almost for Henry's illegitimate children, in a sense, because he's now illegitimized Mary from his first marriage. Elizabeth is now illegitimized, and then he has Henry Fitzroy, so it acts as almost a safeguarding for them, because he believed, or at least says he believes, that she was trying to get rid of his other children. So perhaps in a sense he almost thought he was doing them a favor. Obviously it's questionable of his motives. He obviously wanted rid of her, but perhaps might have played a factor that he was safeguarding his other children.
I mean, I don't think Henry's a particularly great father all round, really. I mean, he never denies Elizabeth's paternity, which he could have done. He could have said, she's not mine. He never does. Yeah. I mean, she clearly is his. Mary later says that Elizabeth had the look of Smeaton about her, which is obviously Mark Smeaton, Anne's lowest born lover. But actually, no one doubts that that Elizabeth is Henry's child. Yeah, so no, I mean, he's an awful parent, even by 16th century standards. I mean, he
wasn't
bastardizes Mary. Yeah, he bastardizes Mary, sends her to serve in Elizabeth's household. I mean, she's not a serving maid, but she's very much shown her place, which is lower than Elizabeth. And then he does the whole thing again with Elizabeth. He's like, yeah, you're illegitimate. And he never legitimizes his daughters, which is, I mean, it's cold, to be honest. I mean, particularly Mary. Yeah, Mary's easy to legitimize because she's born in bona fide parentum. So when she was born, her parents believed they were validly married. Even if you don't think that the marriage was valid, as Henry doesn't, she's clearly legitimate. I mean, it's actually incredibly vindictive. Elizabeth is a trickier one because she's born in Catherine of Aragon's lifetime, and a lot of people think that marriage is valid. It was dispensed by the Pope. So she is a little bit trickier, but he was married to Anne Boleyn. I mean, there's a case for all of them being legitimate, apart from Henry Fitzroy. So no, he's an awful father to his daughters. Even the painting, The Family of Henry VIII, which is obviously at Hampton Court, which is to celebrate the daughters being back in the succession. They're not in the core group of Henry and Jane Seymour, who's obviously dead, and then Edward VI. They're beyond the pillars. They're in the family, but not in the family. So no, I don't think he acted with the interests of his older children at heart at all. I think he's just fairly unpleasant as a parent.
And I'd just like to take a moment to thank our royal and ever generous sponsor, the late King Henry VIII, for providing us with so much fun history to talk about. And a fun fact to you listeners, did you know that 15th century women of nobility wore dresses that fully exposed one or both of their breasts? I mean, how scandalous is that? Another question I have, Elizabeth, is do you think that Henry regretted killing Anne? Obviously, it got him what he wanted with him wanting to marry Jane, and it got him the son that he wanted. But there's a lot of questions being asked about whether he regretted it and whether his anger towards the whole situation dissipated as the years went on, and what your thoughts are about that.
I'd like to say that he did, but I think there's just no signs. Again, Henry, once he's done with you, he's done with you, and you're just gone. You're dead to him. And in fact, I mean, literally, she was dead to him. But I think there's no signs that he regretted it. I think he probably saw himself as completely in the right. She hasn't done what she was supposed to do, and she's been a bad wife as far as he's concerned. So yeah, he's just moved on.
There's a lot of debate with a lot of our readers to whether he did or didn't. And the main argument for why he didn't was that he got rid of almost everything that had any relation to Anne in his court. There's a few surviving things in his treasury that obviously he forgot to do, such as little pins and curtains perhaps he forgot about, but he makes the most effort to get rid of her, doesn't he, in any sense. I mean, even Elizabeth rarely sees her in comparison to his first daughter, Mary.
Yeah. So he destroys Anne's memory, literally in that, he accuses her of adultery and incest, but also physically. He removes the glass panels with her arms in, the glass window panes with her coats of arms in, her badges. He has her badges taken down everywhere that he can find them. Her initials are removed. There's a reason why there are as far as we know, no surviving portraits of Anne from her actual lifetime. They're all slightly later in the 16th century, and it's most likely that people removed them and destroyed them. She's persona non grata. You can't celebrate Anne in any way. So he destroys her memory. And it's an odd one because her parents come back to court, and sort of rehabilitated. So he's not, out to destroy the entire Boleyn family, but certainly, Anne Boleyn is as far as he's concerned, she's just no longer there. And of course, Elizabeth is the living memorial, proof that Anne existed. And in fact, in the family of a Henry VIII portrait, she wears an A pendant, which is clearly referring to Anne. And I'd like to say that that's because Elizabeth chose to wear that to refer to her mother, but almost certainly Henry has ordered her to wear the A pendant, or for it to be painted on, to demonstrate that she's Anne Boleyn's daughter, and that's why she's beyond the pillars. She's not in the central group.
And isn't there a suspicion that with one of the pendants that Elizabeth wore, there was an actual hidden portrait of her mother under there?
Yeah, so it's a checkers ring. Elizabeth had a ring made that she wore, and after her death, it was discovered that it had if you open it up, it's got a hidden compartment, and there are two portraits. One is Elizabeth as queen, definitely her, no doubt, in profile, and the other one is of a woman wearing the dress of about the 1530s. It's probably Anne Boleyn. There's some, it's been suggested it could be Catherine Parr. It could be Catherine Parr. Most likely it's Anne Boleyn. It looks at first glance to have golden hair, but actually it looks like a piece of the enamel has come off, because of course we know Anne Boleyn is dark. Almost certainly it's Anne Boleyn, because actually Elizabeth clearly did have fondness for her mother, and she probably doesn't remember Anne, but she certainly is supportive of Anne's family, sees them as her kin. There's a nice incident when she goes to Norwich Cathedral, where she actually asks for her throne to be facing the Boleyn chapel there, so she can gaze at her ancestors. So she clearly does see herself as a Boleyn in a quite a quiet way, and that you can't really be too open about Anne Boleyn. But yeah, the checkers ring is, I'm pretty sure it is Anne Boleyn. And of course it's made after Anne's death, but Elizabeth knows people who knew Anne, so it's probably quite a good likeness.
She has people that are surrounding her, and she doesn't want to forget her mother, does she? Because although her mother has so much negativity painted around her because of her father, it's her mother at the end of the day. She was
absolutely
years old when her mother died.
Yeah, so James Boleyn, who's her uncle, leaves Elizabeth a book in his will. He dies during her reign, so they've clearly got a relationship. So in fact, he's her great uncle. Sorry, he's Anne's uncle, Thomas Boleyn's brother. Catherine Carey, who is Mary Boleyn's daughter, and will have remembered Anne Boleyn. She's older. She's born about 1526. And she is very, very close to Elizabeth, really, really close. She's also close to Mary Boleyn's son, Henry Carey, as well, and the wider family, so the Howards. She calls him cousin. She's quite reluctant to execute the Duke of Norfolk for his involvement in a plot with Mary, Queen of Scots. And again, it's the kin relationship. And I think partly the Boleyn family are non-threatening to Elizabeth because she's very suspicious of her family on the royal side, so the Grey sisters, particularly Mary, Queen of Scots, because they all have one eye on the throne. Whereas the Boleyns, it's a less complicated relationship for Elizabeth. But yeah, absolutely, she doesn't deny her maternal family, and no attempt is made to deny her maternal family. She's known to be Anne Boleyn's daughter for good or bad, really. But certainly Elizabeth seems to have had a positive view of her mother, and this will have come through people that she has spoken to and have told her about, the real Anne Boleyn rather than sort of the Anne Boleyn of legend.
Yeah, the painted Anne Boleyn almost.
Yeah,
and there's no reason
convicted
for
criminal.
And there's no reason for her to deny her maternal family, is it? They've gone through the trauma, essentially, of Anne's death. There's no reason for her to fear them. There's no negativity. All they want is to survive and just want to support their relative and their queen.
Yeah, absolutely. They're not a political threat to her at all. And in fact, having relatives is a positive thing because they're less likely to betray you. So no, absolutely. It makes sense to promote the Boleyns. And she clearly is very close to some of them, particularly Catherine Carey, her cousin.
And just to get back onto the topic of Anne's execution, Elizabeth wasn't there, was she? She was far away from court at this point, and obviously it's a traumatic point in time for a lot of people. Obviously, it's the execution of a queen. What do you think it was like for Anne on the execution, the morning of her execution? What thoughts do you think was going through her head at that point?
So, I mean, I think by this stage, she had resigned herself to the fact that she is going to be executed. It came as a shock to her. She was talking about being sent to a nunnery. She seems to have cooperated in the annulment of her marriage to some extent, and the marriage has been annulled. I mean, that's sort of an extra irony that she's executed for adultery and incest when her marriage has been annulled. You can't commit adultery if you've never actually been married. So, she knows by the morning of her execution that Henry is going to have her killed. And she swears her innocence on the sacrament, which is about all she can do. Her speech on the scaffold is very composed. And it can look odd to modern eyes because she's not standing there saying, I'm not guilty, I'm being murdered. She's very resigned. She asks people to pray for her. But of course, you have to die a good death. And to die a good death in the 16th century on the scaffold is to be accepting of your fate and to pray for the king. You can't be standing up and swearing your innocence. She does actually say, if anyone wants to meddle in my cause, I'm paraphrasing again, meddle in my cause, I ask them to judge the best, which really goes as far as she can to say, I didn't do it, I'm innocent. However, she has to be really, really careful. Henry's going to have her executed, whatever happens, but she's leaving behind her parents, and she's referred particularly to her mother in the tower, about her mother will die of grief. She's also leaving behind her 2-year-old daughter. Henry probably won't harm Elizabeth, but there is a danger he'll declare that he's not her father. And Anne knows this. There is certainly a danger that he might take action against her parents because, of course, 2 of their children are being executed. And it's clear that Anne has strong affection for her family, particularly her mother and her daughter. She needs to be really careful not to do anything that will jeopardize them. And I think we can see that in the morning of her execution and her scaffold speech, that she's really trying to protect those that she loves and she's leaving behind.
And especially with her speech, it's so composed and almost respectful to Henry. Almost, she's saying, God's almost saying, God save the king. Don't judge him for everything that's happened. She was going out like a queen, and that's what she was. People can say that the marriage was invalid and Henry believed it himself, but she was a queen, and that's what she went out with. And do you think perhaps she was thinking of her daughter in the way that she composed herself? Obviously, there's the danger there, as you've just said, but do you think she wanted her daughter to remember she was a queen, regardless of what her father said?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Absolutely. She's very, very dignified. And often executions don't go well, or, actually people go to pieces. Catherine Howard seems to have said very little on the scaffold. She seems to have been really frightened, understandably, of course. Jane Grey put the blindfold on and then couldn't find the block and seemed to have panicked. It's not always that you do see this sort of composed and dignified end, and no judgment. I would be absolutely terrified if I was on the scaffold in Tower Green. But I think Anne it's remarkable how composed she is. She actually jokes the night before her death that she'll be known as Queen Anne sans tête, so Queen Anne without a head. She knows it's going to happen, and she's doing her last moments. And yes, she is respectful of the king, as she has to be, both to protect her family and by convention. But she's clearly making it clear that she's not guilty and that she's not dying for any, criminal reason.
We've seen from documents that Henry had actually sent for quite a sophisticated executioner, and she was actually done with a sword in comparison to an axe with, the other queens that you've mentioned, and especially Jane Rochford. Perhaps that was a sign of almost slight respect from Henry, that he was getting her a swift executioner. It was not going to be brutal. There was not going to be any, hammering at the neck. It was, he wanted it to be swift, didn't it? But it might have also been respectful, saying, "Want you gone? I'm not going to let you suffer. There you go."
Yeah, I mean, it's really unusual to have a beheading by swordsman in England at the time. It is undoubtedly more merciful. And I know this sounds awful, he's having his wife beheaded, but I mean, it's undoubtedly more merciful.
Weird to be talking about it.
Because axe beheadings were brutal. We think about it being sort of a swing of the axe and job done, but it's not. 2 strokes of the axe was quite a good death. Sometimes they miss and hit the shoulders. It's you are hacked to death to some extent if you are beheaded with an axe, and that doesn't always come across. But I mean, even Thomas Seymour, who has quite a reasonable death, dies with 2 strokes of the axe. So headsman's sword, she will be dead before she even knows it. It is quite merciful. Henry sends for the swordsman before Anne's trial. We know this, he couldn't have got there otherwise. Most likely it's being offered to her as a means to get her to cooperate, possibly in the annulment of her marriage, to provide evidence that's needed. Although most likely the marriage is annulled based on Henry's relationship with Mary Boleyn. They do attempt to prove a prior betrothal between Anne and Henry Percy, but certainly Henry Percy doesn't play ball with that. So yeah, I mean, it is more merciful. I mean, he still beheads her, but at least it doesn't hurt.
Yeah, and that's quite sad to be talking about, isn't it? At least it was merciful. I mean, she got executed, and it's quite sad to say that, but the truth of the matter is it was merciful, and we have to take that into consideration, especially with the fact that he did get the executioner way before Anne went to trial, and he paid quite a bit to have this executioner. I mean, he came from France, didn't he? So it showed that Henry was very careful and meticulous about what he wanted. And might have Anne have waited for a reprieve from her execution? Might she have thought, wait, he won't actually do this, might I go to a nunnery instead rather than this actual execution? Because her execution takes place after the men that she was accused of being adulterous with, wasn't she?
Yeah, so they've already died. Yeah, I mean, she knew Henry better than anybody. I suspect she knew by this stage that a reprieve was unlikely. I mean, I'm sure she would have jumped at the chance, because yes, you're sent to a nunnery, but a lot can change, in decades, I mean, as we know, if she had still been alive and Elizabeth had come to the throne, I mean, undoubtedly Elizabeth would have released her from her nunnery. Yeah, I mean, I suspect Anne knew that she wasn't going to get a reprieve, particularly after the men have died. Henry wants to tidy things up, and by tidying things up, it means not having an ex-wife hanging around.
And I think that something also important about these executions is that Anne's was done quite closed in comparison to what he could have had it open and everybody watching. He could have had people, pay to see her execution. He doesn't do that, does he? He has it quite closed and has, of course, members of his court there to witness it, to, say it's done. It is more respectful to her that way, isn't it? That she has a closed execution rather than a more public one.
Yeah, so she's not publicly shamed in that respect. Most of the royal women that are killed, beheaded in this period, it's in the Tower on Tower Green. So it's a little bit more private, although there are quite a lot of people there, but it's not a public event. Obviously, equally, it means he's not giving her a platform in case she does go off piste, if you like, and say something that she shouldn't do. So it's also Henry controlling the narrative to some extent. So he tries to lock the ambassadors out so that they can't witness the death, because, I mean, it's clearly controversial having your wife beheaded in the 16th century.
Yeah, and it just must have been better for Anne to know that she didn't have to be executed in front of so many people. Of course, there was still a lot of people there, and that's frightening for everyone. Well, we haven't gone through it ourselves, but for anyone who has, they would probably all say, yes, it was scary. But might that have brought her a bit of relief to know, I don't have to die in front of, like, the entire country, per se.
Yeah, she's not got a baying mob, and she's not been the most popular of Henry's wives by any means. In fact, she's probably the least popular of Henry's wives in the popular consciousness. Catherine of Aragon was very much loved by the people in general. So yeah, I mean, it stops her facing a mob. Probably most people would have felt sorry for her. Certainly people we know who are her enemies actually aren't particularly gleeful about her death, because actually it's just shocking, really.
I think that's something that's quite ironic, is that Henry did his best to get rid of Anne's memory. He executed her. She was the least popular of his wives, but she's considered the most popular wife of Henry VIII now to us, because of what he did. He basically made her more famous, and I think he's probably a bit up there. He's a bit upset about that. He didn't like that she's more famous than him in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, she's quite a somewhat controversial figure. Some people really hate her. Most people really love her. People tend to have strong feelings about Anne. She's undoubtedly the most vivid of the six wives. She's the one everyone's heard of. She's the one that people spot from the portrait. Say, yeah, that's Anne Boleyn. I mean, she's completely overshadowed Jane Seymour, who is, of course, her rival in her lifetime. I mean, she's hugely important and influential figure. She's important in the early Reformation. I always think with Anne, we need to look at her as a politician, really. It's sort of, in some respects, a bit of a Thomas Cromwell figure. And of course, she's gained power through marriage, because, I mean, as a woman, there are limited ways that you can gain political power. But she's undoubtedly using her political influence, and she has political goals. So I think, really, she is a very powerful and very important figure.
And even when her execution comes, people try to say, he's got rid of her in the court. There's no evidence of it, but there is. She was a part of the Reformation. She made changes in England, although we don't tend to talk about them a lot. We talk more about, her crimes, so to say. But she did change a lot in England. She did, especially with fashion, as well, wasn't there? There was a lot of changes that she did make, and a lot of people tend to overlook that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she's often depicted wearing the French hood, which is a sort of rounded headwear where you can see the hair, so it's quite daring. She doesn't bring it to England, but she definitely makes it more popular. She's very, very stylish. And the Reformation, I mean, she's too early for us to say she's a Protestant. She just is. She's certainly interested in religious reform. She does have some conservative elements of her faith that we can see. She swears her innocence on the sacrament, for example. A speech that her almoner gives at the Easter before she dies is quite conservative in a lot of elements. But she's certainly a Christian humanist. So she's looking for change, at least within the church, and reform. And she's very much reading French religious reform works. I suspect she would have become a Protestant had she lived another decade. Instead, it's Catherine Parr, who's England's first Protestant queen. But undoubtedly, Anne is the catalyst for the break with Rome and the changes to the English church.
There's a lot of things that are part of our history now that Anne herself was very much responsible for, and perhaps that we ourselves, we don't realize that the value that she has to history. She's not just, the first beheaded queen and the second wife of Henry VIII. She is her own person. She had her own importance, regardless of her marriage to Henry. And perhaps that's why she's such an interesting person, that she has so many layers to her.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Many, many layers. And I mean, a well-rounded character. I mean, a lot of the detail we get about Anne comes from Eustace Chapuis, and he has a really good eye for gossip. He hated Anne, so it's all the negative stuff. But it does make her more rounded. We've got a lot of this negative stuff about Anne. She's going to bring down the pride. She's going to bring down the pride of Mary's unbridled Spanish blood and things like that. She makes Henry cry during arguments before their marriage at court. She insists on taking over making Henry's shirts from Catherine of Aragon, and then gives them to a seamstress to make instead. This is all negative stuff, but it also makes her really rounded as a person. And I think we can relate to her to some extent. I'm not sure we would have been best friends if I was at court with Anne, but she's so human. And I think that is one of the reasons why it's not just about the tragedy of her death. I think she comes across as human. She's flawed. And I think that's really important.
I think she would have been an absolute sight to see if we'd all
Yes.
lived in that point. We would have been so excited to see where it takes her. And I think that takes us to one of our readers. I wanted to know if he had perhaps that son with Anne, or he'd actually changed his mind and not executed her. What do you think the impact of perhaps if Anne, let's say for this first scenario, Anne had a son, her relationship would have been with her daughter? Well, let's go with that scenario first.
Yeah. So if Anne had had a son, let's say her pregnancy in 1536 ended in the birth of a son, she would have been assured she never would have been executed, because Henry wouldn't want to invalidate his son's legitimacy. She would definitely have remained queen. Even if they'd sort of fallen out and lived separate lives, she would never have been divorced. And she would have become regent when her son succeeded in 1547, because the mother of the king almost certainly was regent. Elizabeth would have been much more conventional. She probably would have married a French prince or a Spanish prince, or, a prince. During her brother's reign, I imagine Anne would have been quite an active mother. She's certainly quite active with Elizabeth in the 2.5 years that she has with her. She buys her clothes, she buys her presents, she visits her a lot, which is, royal parents don't live with their children. If it all hung on the son for Anne. Her future would have been entirely different if she'd given birth to a son. And it's a tragedy really for her that she didn't. As much as she loved Elizabeth, and she clearly did, if Elizabeth had been a boy, Anne wouldn't have died, which is,
It's amazing to see how many centuries later, it doesn't matter anymore whether you have a boy or a girl. And do you think Jane would have, if Anne had had that son with Henry, do you think he would have still pursued Jane, or do you think he might have kept it more on a down low, because obviously Anne had this son now and he knew her temper? Do you think that would have been?
Yeah, he definitely would have had mistresses. He had lots of mistresses, kind of casual flings. Generally when his wives were pregnant. Jane probably would have been his mistress. She didn't have many prospects. She's already in her mid-20s and sort of nobody has married her. She's not an heiress. She doesn't come from a particularly high-profile family. Most likely she would have been Henry's mistress. Really, she's doing an Anne Boleyn when she refuses to sleep with Henry and saying, no, I'm too good for that. Because Anne is vulnerable, just as Catherine of Aragon had been vulnerable before with Anne, because they don't have the son. Jane's tragedy is, of course, that she dies after giving birth to the son. She would have had a great life if she'd lived. Regent for her son, queen for the rest of her life. So again, it's another tragedy. Even the one who gives him the son still doesn't live to enjoy it.
Yeah, he doesn't get any relief, does he really? Relief. I don't think relief's a good word to say for a king that literally beheads his wives, but I think
not a nice man.
Not a very nice man, and I sincerely doubt that he would have sent her to a nunnery. But if he did, as you said, if Elizabeth had become queen, which she obviously does, if she hadn't, do you think she would have perhaps gone and visited her mother? Might there have been a chance she might have, she was legitimate at this point. Might she have perhaps renounced it all and gone to the same nunnery as her mother? Unlikely as it was, but might there have been that?
The difficulty, of course, is that Henry dissolves all the nunneries. So by 1540, they were all closed. So that could have been a problem if he had sent Anne to a nunnery, because what do you do with this ex-nun, really? Some sort of imprisonment, most likely, I would think. She certainly would have been released by Elizabeth. I imagine Elizabeth would have built a relationship with her as much as she could. She clearly showed affection towards her mother, as little as sort of, their relationship was tiny, because Elizabeth is only 2 when Anne is executed, probably doesn't remember her. I mean, if you sort of think back to when you're 2.5, it's kind of, a few memories maybe, but not any kind of understanding of a relationship. So Elizabeth's understanding of Anne comes through people that knew her, but I suspect that she wouldn't have been kept entirely apart from Anne. Elizabeth wasn't worth that much to Henry once she was illegitimized anyway. She may even have been allowed to stay at the nunnery until it was closed to some extent. But yeah, so I mean, Anne's future after 1558 would have looked a lot rosier when her daughter became queen. It might have been a bit trickier for Elizabeth to become queen if Anne was still alive, and a reminder that of, you know, adultery and incest and questions over her paternity. It's difficult to say, but Henry went for the much neater solution and had her beheaded, fortunately.
I can't stop thinking about how sad it must have been for her to be executed and not even be able to say goodbye to her daughter. I mean, she separated from her for so long, and it's just heart-wrenching to think about, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is tragic. I mean, it's regardless of how people feel about Anne, and she is a bit like Marmite, people love her or hate her, but yeah, I mean, it's undoubtedly tragic that she lost the relationship with her daughter, and it was close. I mean, equally, Catherine of Aragon had lost her relationship with her daughter. They're separated after 1531. Henry is not a good parent, you know.
I think he's the worst parent that you could probably have, especially for a father, but there are certainly worse examples.
Yeah. I mean, he doesn't kill any of them. You know, I mean, Ivan the Terrible sort of beats his eldest son to death. So there's that. But no, I mean, he doesn't put his children's interests in any way. And you wouldn't expect a 16th century parent to do that, a 16th century father. I mean, particularly a lot of the trickiness between Henry and Mary is due to the fact that Mary's not obeying him. And she is his daughter. She should obey him. You know, you're supposed to honor your father and your mother, but particularly your father. So from his perspective, actually, these children should do what he says, regardless of what he does to them. And Elizabeth hasn't caused any offence. She's only small, but she's Anne Boleyn's daughter.
Obviously, there's been a lot of portrayals of Anne's execution in TV and movies. Could you tell us about which one you think is the most accurately portrayed?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's a tricky one. I mean, her actual execution tends to be fairly accurate because it's so dramatic. The swordsman, the speech, you know, the fact that this queen is coming out to die. You know, Natalie Dormer in the Tudors, and the Tudors in general is horrific for accuracy. But actually, her death is very moving. You know, I mean, Natalie Dormer is great as Anne Boleyn. You know, you have to kind of watch the show and go, oh no. But she's fabulous as Anne Boleyn. Genevieve Bujold in Anne of Thousand Days. I mean, that's my favorite depiction of Anne by miles. I think she's wonderful. The execution scene is, again, really, really moving and really well done. I mean, there's artistic liberties with all of them. I mean, in Anne of the Thousand Days, Henry and Anne have a showdown in the tower, which of course we'd like
never
to have
happened,
but didn't happen. And I don't, you know, Elizabeth, Anne would never have been saying, you know, my Elizabeth will be the greatest queen, because really she's kind of hoping, please just don't deny her as your child, at least let her grow up in the royal court. But yeah, so I mean, I would say those two execution scenes are particularly good, but in general, the execution tends to be quite well done, and it is because it is just, you can't really improve on that. You know, it is show-stoppingly awful, but you kind of are compelled to kind of, you know, watch it to some extent. And I think Anne had very little agency left, but she very much stole the show at her death.
And I think that's something that we have to take into consideration, is that not all shows and not all historical, even books, are always accurate. But the one thing you can always tell is how precise they are with Anne's execution, because you can't muck that up, can you? This is a significant part of history. And that's why we're celebrating, well, not celebrating, but remembering Anne's death on the 19th. So I just want to thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining us and talking so much about Anne Boleyn. She's such a fascinating character to talk about. And just thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been a real pleasure. I mean, it's always great to be able to talk about Anne Boleyn. I think absolutely we remember her. You know, she even wrote in her prayer book, you know, remember me when you do pray. And I think that's what she wanted. She wanted people not to forget her.
And I think that's something that she has been able to do, is make sure people remember her. And she's definitely somebody of great importance, and someone that we should always think about when we go to women in history that had an importance. And now I'd just like to say a quick thank you to all of my listeners for joining us today. And if you'd like to keep up to date with our posts, click the subscribe button down below to be notified when we post. And until then, have a Tudorific week.